If you turn your notes to Roman numeral 7, we are dealing with basic methods of interpretation, and we began by simply saying that our greatest example of how to interpret the Bible should be found in the example of Christ and the apostles. Those of you who have taken the course material previously on the structure of the Bible, you will note that I had mentioned that Matthew, Romans, and Hebrews, each of them the first book in the threefold division of the New Testament, where you have historical, and then you have theological, and then you have practical, that these three books quote more of the Old Testament than all the other books put together. And there is a distinctive reliance upon the Old Testament when you read the New Testament scriptures. Indeed, one of the greatest perplexing theological issues that has been in the church and raged since the first century, believe it or not, in the first century, they were arguing over the relationship of the Old and New Testament. What is the Christian's relationship to the Hebrew Scriptures? Not just to the Mosaic Law and Covenant, not just to the Levitical codes, but to the Old Testament itself. Well, one thing is abundantly clear after nearly 2,000 years of preaching and doing theology. It is that we cannot ignore the Old Testament. And the method by which Christ, the Messiah, God incarnate, interpreted the Old Testament should give us our example. We've come to paragraph E. The writers of Scripture treat the text of Scripture as being a reliable historical account from which they can draw ethical and moral imperatives and prohibitions. We gave 3 biblical examples of where this was done, and in the third example, would you please turn to Matthew chapter 12. Now, the reason I want to focus on this passage in particular is that some of you come out of a Sabbatarian background. If you had been involved with the various Adventist denominations, and you must understand, there are over 100 Adventist denominations. Now, one of the most well-known, of course, would be the Seventh-day Adventists, but there are the Seventh-day Baptists. And there are the Christians and the Advent Christian. And there are over 100 Adventist churches that came out of the William Miller movement in the early parts of the 19th century. I have in my library a first edition of William Miller's book in which he predicted the coming of Christ in 1843 in the month of October. Now, his argument was quite simple. Jesus said, "No man knoweth the day nor the hour," so Willie said, "Well, at least I know the month and the year." And this book was printed in 1840, and this was the seminal work that ignited the evangelical world into believing that the return of Christ would take place in October, and they always chose the end of the month. Same thing with the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, which came out of the Adventist movement. Whenever they talked about the end of the world, like 1975, it was always October. Or Armageddon in 1914, October. I think there must be a relationship between false prophets and Halloween, is my suspicion, because they always talked about the end of October would be the return of the Lord. Well, you also have the Worldwide Church of God under Armstrong, and of course his particular cult was like some kind of Cajun gumbo. There was a dash of Seventh-day Adventism, a spoon of Mormonism, and there was a whole cup of Jehovah's Witness teaching, and it was a combination, and the final spice that livened the whole thing up was British Israelism. And of course, Sabbatarianism developed in cultic circles in an attempt to say that the Christian is bound by the Old Testament day of the Sabbath, which we would call Saturday, though they wouldn't want to call it that. because, of course, a Saturday is for Saturn, the god Saturn. But also within evangelical circles, Sabbatarianism, particularly among our Presbyterian friends, reached the point of being a form of legalism that made Sunday an absolute downer. An absolute downer. I can think of one church in Mechanicsburg. The church is no longer with us. It is now used to store lumber. And this church had a pastor who really got into a Reformed concept of Sabbatarianism called the Scottish Puritan view, in which children were not allowed to laugh or play on God's holy Sabbath, which was Sunday. You were not allowed to do anything that gave you pleasure. Now, a couple came to my church and then wanted to come to my home afterwards, and so they were busily eating, and I put some classical music on, as I'm wont to do. And the man said, "Oh, no, please, don't put Bach on. Please, it's the Sabbath." Well, I was curious. I said, "Well, what's wrong with Bach?" He said, "Well, classical music gives me pleasure, and you're to refrain from anything that gives you pleasure on the Sabbath." And of course, they took the verse, "Thou shalt refrain thy foot from doing thy pleasure on my holy day, saith the Lord." Now, this principle led to the idea that you may take a bath, but you may not swim in your pool. You may sleep on the sofa, but not with the television on. It has led to a whole host of laws and regulations, and some of these churches have in their constitution that if you were to buy a gallon of milk for your kids on Sunday, you would be disciplined. It means, supposedly, you cannot read a Sunday paper. Now, the surprise, of course, is that the Sunday paper was actually printed Saturday. But nevertheless, it means you shouldn't read the Monday paper, you see. And I guess the climax came with the Puritan idea that a husband and wife should take no fleshly pleasures in each other on the Sabbath day, and that it would be sin. It was on this basis that the great Jonathan Edwards was officially kicked out of his church. The New England Puritans believed the day of birth was the day of conception. And after his second child was born on Sunday, he was convicted of Sabbath breaking, meaning that his children had been conceived on Sunday, therefore he was in sin. So they had tried everything they could think of to get rid of this great revival preacher, and they found the technicality because his children were born on Sunday. We have any Sunday babies here? Anybody born on Sunday? Then we see a host of Sabbath breakers in our midst. And Sabbatarianism, as I explained in the booklet, and we brought a ton of them tonight for those of you who are interested, can be in a cultic form or in a Christian form. Either way, it leads to legalism. A legalism that binds the conscience and destroys the joy of the Lord's day. Now, by the way, you know the way I like to answer people, and when this young man told me he couldn't listen to classical music because it was pleasurable, I laid a trap for him a few minutes later and says, "Oh, do you enjoy Pastor Martin's preaching?" "Oh, yes, I do." I said, "Well, then you should refrain from listening to him on the Sabbath." "Do you take pleasure when you worship? Do you take pleasure from the hymns that you sing?" "Well, you must refrain from hearing preaching. You must refrain from worship. As a matter of fact, the only thing you'll be able to do is to lie in your bed with the lights out, unless you enjoy that and take pleasure from that as well." Now, the reason that Sabbatarianism arose is due to the fact that the average Christian has a totally false view of the nature and function of the Ten Commandments. How many of you, in your lifetime, you were told that the Ten Commandments should rule the conscience of the Christian as well as the Jew of the Old Testament. As a matter of fact, if you go to the Christian Reformed Church, they begin, Lord's Day 95, hear the law of God. Thus saith the Lord thy God who took thee out of the land of Egypt, etc. And they read the Ten Commandments every single Sunday. So that the average Christian, if you ask them, do you believe that the Ten Commandments applies today? That as a follower of Jesus Christ, you should go back to the Old Testament, to the book of Exodus or the book of Deuteronomy, and you should take the Ten Commandments, and the Ten Commandments is the code of the Christian life. How many of you perhaps have assumed that at some point in your Christian walk? Okay? Now, how many of you assume, because of Cecil B. DeMille and Charlton Heston's wonderful job, that the two tablets for the Ten Commandments were either divided 5 and 5 or 4 and 6, and maybe you've even heard discussions or entered into discussions whether or not the tablets had 4 on this side and 6 on this one, or 5 and 5. How many of you have ever heard of, entered into a discussion, or assumed that the two tablets were one huge piece of stone with 2 sides? How many of you remember that? A few of you participating. Would you turn with me back to the book of Exodus before we do an exegesis of Matthew 12? And what I want you to understand, Exodus chapter 20, is that the 10 Commandments, called the 10 words or the Decalogue, were part of a unique covenant never before given and never given again in the history of the world, specifically to a theocratic nation called Israel, where God was king and he called the shots. A theocracy simply means God rules instead of democracy, where the people rule. We live basically in a republic system in which we have representatives who represent the people, but even our Declaration of Independence begins with we, the what? The people. Now, a theocracy doesn't have we, the people. A theocracy says, I am God, I call the shots, that's it. No argument, no contract negotiations, no labor unions, no religious union. There were no unions among the priests who then agitated, well, we want a bigger cut of the lamb, as it is on the altar. A theocracy is where theos does the ruling as an autocrat, a monocrat. And the literary form found in Exodus chapter 20 is in a specific kind of form that predates Moses. Now, some of you may have gone along to a stationery store and picked up one of these write your own will kits. You can go to the stationery store and pick up a will. You know, fill it in. What we have in the Exodus 20 version of the Ten Commandments is a literary form that is called a suzerainty covenant that predates Moses. It was a legal contract imposed upon the conquered nation by the king who conquered that nation. The concept of covenant, or beneath, that's operating in this book, Exodus, and the later in Deuteronomy, is not of two equals sitting down and having contract negotiations. Now, a friend of mine was on Politically Incorrect this last week, and they got into Jesse Ventura's tirade against organized religion. Sorry to say, he wasn't able to think on his feet. But I was having to imagine if there was by hook or crook I could get on the show, and a friend of mine said he's going to seek to try to arrange that. that when the guy said, well, I have no problem with religion, it's just organized religion. I have no problem with religious people, it's organized religion. And organized religion was the bad boy. And all the actresses and other ignorant people on the panel were all whipping organized religion. And I said, Lord, what would have been the best way to deal with this is simply to say, well, I have no problem with politics, it's organized politics. I don't believe in the state or in government. I don't mind medicine, but it's organized medicine. I don't believe in hospitals. I don't believe in the AMA. I don't have any problem with labor. It's organized labor, so we should not believe in unions. In other words, why religious people getting organized is inherently evil, and we can organize for any other reason, even to have an organization against organized religion. Seems to be the height of hypocrisy. But what we have here in this literary form is a suzerainty covenant in which God, as the conquering king, imposes his will on the vassal nation, who is now referred to as the slave of Jehovah. There were no negotiations, as you can see. In the literary form, you first have what is called the preamble. Verse 1, then God spoke all these words, saying, I am Yahweh your God. In the other suzerainty covenants, it begins by saying, I am whatever the name of the king is. I am Hutmos III, ruler of all I see. This is where the conquering king announces himself and then mentions why this nation should listen to him. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So understand, God is picking up the literary form of a suzerainty covenant, and he is using the preamble, I am the conquering king, and you are the conquered nation. Then we have a series of statements. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol or any likeness of what is in heaven above, or in the earth beneath, or in the water under the earth. You shall not worship them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, on the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. Underline the word hate. Idolatry and false religion comes from the hatred of God, not the love of God. See, humanists say, oh, well, the Hindus and the Buddhists, and, well, you've got to understand that all the religions of the world, regardless if they're worshiping Pan, that half goat, half man, or tree stumps or crocodiles, that they just love God, and they're in the wilderness with Al Gore, and they're looking for something to worship. Okay? Idolatry is rooted in what emotion of the heart? What does the text say? Hate. Hate. False religion comes from hatred of the truth, but love of the lie. Hatred of God. That's why Romans 1 says, God haters. You say, well, people really don't hate God. Give them a hammer and give them some nails and wait. And when that hammer goes on the thumb, then you will see that people by nature hate God. And he says idolatry is a form of hatred, but showing loving kindness to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of Yahweh your God in vain, for Yahweh will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or female servant, or your cattle, or your sojourner who stays with you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, and the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor thy father and thy mother, that your days may be prolonged in the land which Yahweh your God gives you. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. End quote. Now, one of the problems we face is that quotation marks are modern invention that weren't part of the biblical text. How many of you are aware of the fact that 40 years later, Moses had to turn around and teach these same words or commandments to a new generation of Jews who never heard them? Because the generation that heard these disobeyed God and died in the wilderness. 40 years later, he had to circumcise the people and to teach them. Why? Well, because he was dealing with unregenerate people who disobeyed God because there was no fear of the Lord in their heart. And when God told them, you shall not enter the promised land, but you're going to drop dead in the desert, well, then they said, phooey on you and your religion. So did they circumcise their boys? No. Did they teach their kids about the Lord? No, they were bitter. They were angry with God. Well, he brought us out of Egypt to die in a desert. It's like going to Death Valley for 40 years. And God had imprisoned them in the walls of that desert. So they didn't teach their kids anything. So Moses was faced with a heathen generation that needed to receive the sign of the covenant. And this generation also had to be taught. So when you turn over to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 5, here you have the second account given 40 years later of the Ten Commandments. Now, I cannot go into great length. I don't have the overhead, so you're just going to have to listen to me. It's in the book. When you compare the Ten Commandments as given in Deuteronomy 5 with the Ten Commandments given in Exodus 20, they are not exactly the same. Now, the liberal theologians rub their hands. Hallelujah, we got a contradiction in the Bible. Oh, they just love it, they love it, they love it. Take, for example, the statement about keeping the Sabbath, verse 12, Deuteronomy 5, observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy. That's not the same words we read over in Exodus 20. As the Lord your God commanded you, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant, your female servant, or your, what is the next word? Ox. That's not in Exodus 20. He added something. Matter of fact, as you go through this, you'll find that he adds and subtracts and he rearranges the order of the items that are mentioned in verse 14. He says, your donkey or any of your cattle or your sojourner who stays with you, your male servant, your female servant, may rest as well as you. Now, after that same basic message was given in Exodus 20, then he went to the creation. For in 6 days, will you notice, does he now bring up the creation of the Exodus? There's no creation account. It ain't there. It's gone. Instead, we have, you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out of there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Not one word about God creating the world in 6 days. I give you a chart in the book in which you can see that the two versions of the Ten Commandments are not the same. Oi, what are we going to do? Well, remember, contradictions in the Bible are simply apparent contradictions. What is a failure to observe, and remember what I keep telling you, that when you're reading the Jewish Bible, what should you put on? Your yarmulke. You got to think like a Jew in order to read this book. And when you go to the Jews, they point out the original 10 Commandments were called the 10 words because they were just 10 short sentences, often of only 3 or 4 words. Shall not murder. That's it. Keep Sabbath day. That's it. You say, now wait a second. You mean the original 10 Commandments written by the finger of God on the clay, like these clay tablets we get, dug up out of the ancient Middle East? You mean all these other words about in 6 days and your camels and your ox and your cattle and this, what is all that? That wasn't part of it. No, it wasn't in the tablet at all.
If you put it in your other pocket, it won't do that.
As a matter of fact, what we have is this. When you turn to the New Testament where it quotes the 10 Commandments, you only get these short sentences. For example, do not covet, period. That's all that God wrote with his finger on the tablet. Moses then illustrated to the people. He preached on the commandment, and we have it confused. What he preached, what he explained, what he expounded, we stick in the commandments as if it's part of the commandment. That's why in Exodus 20, when he talked about the Sabbath day, he said, well, like for example, an illustration, the universe was created in 6 days. But when he came 40 years later, he used another illustration. He says, God took us out of Exodus with a mighty hand. You will notice that he had to add words, change. Verse 14, the commandment had been given that you're not to do any work on the Sabbath day, which was Saturday, neither you, your male servant, your female servant, etc. But he didn't say ox. What did some smart Jews do during the 40-year period? It didn't say ox. So guess what they had treading out the wheat? The ox. Or they'd put a donkey. In other words, Moses was faced with people who found loopholes in the commandments, so he had to add and close the loopholes. The same thing with the commandment, don't covet. That's all it said. That's all it said. He had to add things, take away things, rearrange things, because that's what you would do, dear preacher friend, and that's what you would do. Now, the tablets were not one tablet looking like a big butterfly. Forget Cecil B. DeMille. That's Hollywood. Suzerainty covenants were always written on clay tablets, and they used cuneiform with a little stick. They do this writing, which actually is the ancient form of Hebrew. They made 2 tablets, both of them exact copies. One for the conquering king and one for the vassal servant, the vassal nation. All 10 on this one, all 10 on that one. And then these 2 clay tablets were put in the Ark of the Covenant. And a covenant was ratified with the nation of Israel that these 10 short, pithy commands, like don't murder. That's all it said. It didn't have to go into a great illustration. Now that's preached later. Don't covet. Don't make idols. And then all the rest of that was added. 2 tablets. Now the other thing that must be understood is that in every suzerainty covenant that has ever been found, beside the preamble and then a series of commandments, there is always a ceremony smack dab in the middle of the tablet that was the touchstone of the covenant. That is, you could break all of the various commandments that the conquering king was imposing on the nation, and nothing really bad would happen to you as long as you kept up the ceremony which symbolized your submission to the king. There is only one ceremony within the Ten Commandments, and it's the Sabbath ceremony. Now, your older theologians recognized that as Christians, they were worshiping on what day of the week? Sunday. And the Ten Commandments in the Sabbath command was talking about what day of the week? Saturday. Now, obviously, there's a problem. That's why Adventist cults grow and flourish, and that's their main bait they put on the hook. The problem is this: the Sabbath command is not a moral law binding on all men everywhere in every culture. It is not supratemporal. It is not supracultural. It is not a moral law because it is not reflective of God's character. When the commandment said, "You shall not lie," it's because it says God cannot what? Lie. When the commandments reflect even adultery, because God is not unfaithful. Even when we are unfaithful, He is what? Faithful. So God says, I'm faithful, you should be faithful. I don't lie, you don't lie. But when it comes to the Sabbath commandment, you're not in the realm of God's nature. You're not in the realm of human nature, the image of God within man. You are smack dab in what is called positive law or ceremonial law, hooked to a day and to certain cultural observances that are not transferable. For example, you may not light a fire. If you have a fire left over from Friday, you may not throw sticks on it to keep it going. Now, if you were up in the North Pole and you could have no heat in your little igloo, you would be dead. You'd be dead. The sanctions were so severe as to be more severe than the other ones. Why? If you merely picked up sticks on the Sabbath day, what happened to you? You were to be stoned to death. So in the midst of the Suzerainty covenant, there's a ceremony called the Sabbath, and as long as Israel observed the Sabbath, although they broke all the other commandments, didn't they do idolatry? Didn't they do adultery? All the time. Isaiah said, now that you have defamed the Sabbath, God's kicking you out. This is why you have almost a dozen places where it says the Sabbath is a sign between Israel and God. This is why in all the condemnations of the Gentiles, and the Gentiles are referred to as adulterers, liars, thieves, because those commands, being reflective of the moral character of God and of the image of God within man, those commands refer to principles that are supratemporal. They're impervious to age and dispensation. They are supracultural. Doesn't matter where you are. Doesn't matter Hottentot, Eskimo, Australian, Japanese. You don't murder. Question: is there one place in the entire Bible where the Gentiles were condemned for being Sabbath breakers? Not once. Now wait a second. You mean 9 of the 10 are applied to the Gentiles and they are condemned for failing to keep them? That's right. But the 4th commandment about the Sabbath, no one is condemned for that. That's right. As a matter of fact, 9 of the 10 are repeated in the New Testament, but guess which of the 10 commandments is never repeated and applied to the Christian church in the New Testament? Again, the commandment about the Sabbath, to keep it holy. What you have then is a suzerainty covenant. You have the ceremony in that context. It's an example of a culturally bound ceremony like circumcision and like the animal sacrifices, which were swept away by Christ, and thank God they're gone. Forever gone. Now, the final proof of this, believe it or not, is found in Matthew chapter 12. Now, I've had the honor of 5 or 6 books being written against me, and I don't mind it when the Muslims write their books, and I just heard today there's an Adventist book out there now trying to undo my book, Death in the Afterlife. There's a Jehovah's Witness scholar desperately trying to undo the damage of the book on the Trinity. I'm still waiting for that. But one book that did distress me was from fellow Christians who were extreme Sabbatarians who then decided to write a book to undo this little booklet. Now, this is just a little booklet. How many of you would agree? This doesn't look like the Trinity book, does it? This so infuriated them, they wrote 150 pages, single space, in an attempt to get rid of this. They would not openly debate me. They would not dialogue with me. Neither would they let me be a part of a panel to discuss this. I simply was persona non grata in Reformed Baptist circles. They appealed to Matthew 12 and to its parallel in the Gospel of Mark as proving that the Sabbath is a moral law that was observed first by Adam and then to be observed by all men and women as his example. But I must tell you, when I wrote a 6-page response to the 157, I think it was, page book, I said, you chose the wrong passage. You chose a passage that actually does your position in. Now let me explain what I mean by that. How many of you would agree that God is one in nature? Within the being or essence of God, would you expect to find confusion, contradiction, or conflict in which the attributes of God fight against each other, so God really doesn't know what he's going to do? Any of you think God is confused, contradictory? He has different attributes raging against? No. We call it the unity of God in theology. Now, the moral law, everybody agrees, is a reflection of the moral character of God. Be ye holy, for your Father in heaven is what? Holy. It's very simple. Moral laws are never in conflict with each other. You never have to break one moral law in order to keep another moral law. All the theologians agree on this, because it would imply, if that had to be the case, that God was either stupid, he gave us 2 laws which are contradictory, in which you have to break one to keep the other, and they're both, in other words, you would have to sin. Sin would be the result of his rigging it. So everyone says, no, that's obvious. Moral laws will not be in conflict. Anyone who tells you, in order to honor my father and my mother, I committed adultery. How many of you would buy that? See, it doesn't work. In order to keep the Sabbath day, in order to do this, that, or the other, if all of those 10 laws are moral laws, you will never find a contradiction where you have to choose one over the other. The second corollary proposition is this. When a moral law is in conflict with a ceremonial law, the ceremonial law must always give way. That if you have to choose between a law that was culturally bound or whatever it is, and a law which is moral and eternal and reflective of God's character, well, the moral law always has preeminence. There's no question whatsoever. Matthew 12 gives you such an example. According to the ceremonial law, only the priests were allowed to eat the dedicated bread, the showbread. But the moral law says you shall not kill. So the priest was faced with the conflict. On this hand, David and his friends cannot eat this bread. It's for us alone. On the other hand, I will kill them with starvation. The moral law, you shall not kill, therefore takes precedent, and I'm going to break the ceremonial law, and I'm going to give the bread to them to eat to fulfill the moral law. Thus, a moral law, when in conflict with the ceremonial law, always has the upper hand. No question about it. Now let's read this passage, which they thought was my Waterloo. At that time, Jesus went on the Sabbath through the grain fields, and his disciples became hungry and began to pick the heads of grain and eat. Now, you remember, as when I preached through the power of Jesus over nature, what do I like to do? I like to put all the gospel accounts together. Have any of you been doing that since I preached? A little bit of that, hopefully? Yes. When you put this together, the disciples were walking, and they got hungry. And there was some wheat. And they picked it, and they rolled it, and got the husks off, and ate the kernels as they were walking along. Now, were they harvesting? Well, of course they were harvesting. Doesn't matter if it's 1 head or 1,000. Harvesting is harvesting when you take a plant product. Now, were they not only harvesting, were they processing it? Now, some people had a big stone wheel in which they were doing, but rubbing between the fingers. Were they harvesting grain? Were they processing it? And then were they eating it? So the Pharisees said, we've got them, we've got them, we've got them. Hallelujah, we've got them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to Jesus, now look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on a Sabbath day. Were you allowed to go out in the fields and harvest wheat on the Sabbath day? Or to process it in your little flour mill? But, and remember, you always look for that word because it's the study of what? It'll take me 5 years, if I'm still here, for you finally to circle the word but. Look for it. Circle it. But, he said to them, have you not read? So number one, he was going to challenge them with a question based upon the fact that they claimed to be the teachers of Israel and to be students of the Bible. So he's turning the tables on them beautifully. He says, now you guys read the Bible, right? Mm-hmm. Well, haven't you read the story, what David did when he became hungry? He and his companions. You know how he entered the house of God and they ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful. The letter of the law would say he wasn't allowed to eat that, or those who were with him. But it was for the priests alone. Did you guys ever read that story back there? Imagine these Pharisees going, oh, yeah, okay. They know what's coming. Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath day the priests in the temple, underline the next words, break the Sabbath. The first instance, breaking the law about eating the showbread. The second illustration, breaking the Sabbath by working on the Sabbath. Question: is there ever a passage that says, did you not read where they broke the commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery, but they did so without punishment and with God's blessing? He is saying here, listen, you must understand, they break the Sabbath, but in God's eyes they are what? Underline the word. What does it say? Innocent. What? You can break the fourth commandment about the Sabbath and you're innocent? Yes, but is that true of any other commandment? Can you break any other commandment and be held innocent? But I say to you that something greater than the temple is here. He referred to himself in the neuter. But if you had known what this means, I desire compassion and not a sacrifice, you would not have condemned whom? He said, my disciples are perfectly innocent. Yeah, they broke the Sabbath. They harvested for their own use. They processed it. They ate it. But just like the priests, when they break the Sabbath, they're innocent. My disciples are innocent, and you are a bunch of judgmental, critical twits. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And he can change it, abolish it, or do whatever he wants with it. Question. Remember how moral laws will never conflict with each other? That's right. Don't we have a conflict between thou shalt not kill and you shall keep the Sabbath day? Yes. You have a conflict between those commandments. Remember how that if there's a contest between a moral law and a ceremonial law, the moral law always wins? Like with the showbread? The Sabbath command is one that has tons of exceptions. The Westminster Confession says, you shall keep it except for works of necessity and mercy. So if your ox falls in the ditch, what do? You pull it out. Now, that phrase, works of necessity and mercy, has been stretched to the full limits like a balloon. As I pointed out to some of my Sabbatarians, you sit in an air-conditioned building with lights on. Does that mean there has to be someone out there working at the power plant to provide you with that? You should sit in darkness without any electricity on. You shouldn't be able to flush the toilets. If you're flushing the toilets, someone has to be at the waterworks, making sure. Matter of fact, the Jews who take the Sabbath seriously, they have computerized toilet flushing. Computerized, they have what are called kosher computer-framed houses now, where when it comes, the house literally turns off and on and does all of its things completely by computer. Because in their mind, as long as I don't move the lever and flush the toilet, then I haven't broken the Sabbath. If the ceremonial law says you will circumcise your male child, on which day? What if that fell on the Sabbath day? You circumcise him anyway. Which means the circumcision law has preeminence over the Sabbath. Now, one ceremonial law can conflict with another ceremonial law. One ceremonial law can take precedent, but the circumcision command would never take precedent over the Sabbath if it were in fact a moral law based on the character of God and eternal in the... would never make it. Never make it. Now if you turn over to Mark, to the parallel passage, chapter 2, verse 23. This is so we look at the other gospel account. Mark 2, verse 23. And it came about that he was passing through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples began to make their way along while picking the heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, "See here, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and became hungry, he and his companions? How we entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the consecrated bread, which it wasn't lawful for anyone to eat except the priest. And he gave it also to those who were with him." And he was saying to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath." Now this book, which was dedicated to refute me, used that as the text to prove that Adam kept the Sabbath. They said, you will see here that in the original it says, the man was not made for Sabbath, but the Sabbath was made for the man. Therefore it refers to an individual, and that can only be for Adam. And Adam being a Sabbath keeper before Moses means it's a creation ordinance and all men should keep it. Well, I happen to be in conversations with the great Dr. Julius Manti, one of the most brilliant Greek scholars the 20th century ever saw. He, along with his friend Dana, produced the #1 Greek grammar called the Dana and Manti Greek Grammar. He was a disciple of A.T. Robertson, those of you who know his word pictures in the New Testament. And I called up Julius. I says, "Julius, could you help me out here? I'm looking at the Greek text, and these people somehow got an individual out of this and said Adam was keeping the Sabbath." You could hear the guffaws coming all the way up from Florida. He said, according to Greek grammar, the grammar is saying not an individual. It cannot be an individual according to the rules of grammar. By the way, the definite article and the declensions and the verb, matter of fact, he said, I think I used that. Or A.T. Robertson uses this passage as an illustration of where the worst possible thing you can do if you're totally ignorant of Greek grammar is to think it refers to an individual. What it is saying is this: if the Sabbath was a moral law and reflected God's moral character, then man would be made for the Sabbath. But since it is only a ceremonial law, like cutting your hair, animal sacrifice, then actually it was made for us. Now, God's holiness is not made for us. It would not state it this way. So it is not referring to an individual. It simply means humanity in the generic sense of mankind. We are not created for the purposes of ceremonial laws. We are created to reflect the moral law of God, but not ceremonial. And when he said, consequently, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath, it means he has the right to cancel it by way of fulfillment in himself. Now, the rest of the arguments are given in the booklet, but I want to open this up to question and answer because I'm sure there are questions that have come to your mind. When I said the Ten Commandments was a culturally bound and limited covenant made between Israel and God, I was not saying that the moral principles underneath those commandments do not apply today. The moral principles do apply today. It was wrong to murder before Moses, under Moses, and after Moses. So I'm not saying freed from the law, oh happy condition, now we can sin and still have remission. I'm not talking about antinomianism. So get me straight. I'm saying the particular expression that was given to a theocracy, and it is not something you can switch over to the church, to our nation. Questions on the Sabbath and things of that nature. I'll let the child go first. Go ahead. You had a question or? Oh, think it through and then get back to me, okay? There was another, Joel, I'll work my way back.
Using the Lord's name in vain, what exactly does that mean? We take it as using profanity, but are there other ways of using the Lord's name in vain besides profanity?
Now, it's only, Joel, when we're discussing the Sabbath brings up another command. But that's good anyway. What we're talking about, the Jews felt there was so much ignorance on what that meant, they said they would never say the name Yahweh. That's how superstitious they became. It simply means to use the name of God flippantly, like, oh my, or damn it, or other expressions that are blasphemous, foul. It means not to be irreverent, not to make God a buffoon, and not to mock or ridicule the Holy One. That is what it's talking about. It's not funny to mock the Creator God. So that commandment is a very wise. But we can say that. See, the Old Testament says, Shema Yisrael, Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad. But the modern Jew says, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, because he can't pronounce Yahweh. He's frightened to death of it, so he still uses another word. Well, I happen to know Yahweh, so I can use his name. They don't know him. That's why they don't know his name. Another question. Come on over. You're going to try it this time.
How did we get the name Jew and Gentile?
The name Jew is of more recent derivation. As you look in the Old Testament, the first references will be to the word Hebrews, like Hebrew slaves in Egypt. The term Jew is something that developed in the intertestamental period after the exiles. That's why you find it in the New Testament, but not in the Old Testament. And it is probably a shortened version for the sons of Judah. So these are the Judaizers, the Judas. And it contracted. Exactly when it began and who started it, scholars have given up and nobody knows. Another question.
That the Messianic Jews are incorrect to celebrate.
The question has to do with the present popularity of the Messianic movement. I used to attend those things. I was way back in 1962 with the American Board of Mission to the Jews before there was a Messianic movement. And when someone became a Christian, they joined the Christian church and sat down with Gentiles and celebrated the Lord's Day and the Lord's Supper and sang the same hymns. Because in the church there's to be neither Jew nor Gentile, neither bond or free, neither man. There were to be no such distinctions, but Christ had torn the curtain from the top to the bottom. Then, in the famous Jews for Jesus movement, there began to be some spin-offs which were very vigorously resisted by American Board of Mission to the Jews and other historic Jewish evangelism organizations. There was a growing tendency to say we Jews should meet separately and we should have synagogues, not churches. We should meet Friday night for Shabbat. We should not meet Sunday, the Lord's Day. And we should have all the cultural trappings from yarmulkes Matter of fact, I called a guy not too long ago. He jumped on the phone. Are you keeping Succoth? I said, Christ is my Succoth. I don't need a Succoth. How many of you know what Succoth is? Festival of booths, where they go out in the parking lot and they tie some branches together and sit in there for a little while. Christ is the fulfillment of the law. So I told him after he chided me, you should be doing Succoth. You don't do Sabbath. You don't. I said, look, Christ tore the curtain from the top to the bottom, and you Messianic guys are busy sewing it right back up. I don't mind evangelizing, but when you come to segregation of Gentile versus Jew, it leads to a veiled form of racism where we Messianic Jews are more precious in the sight of Christ than you bunch of Gentile dogs. We are the kings, you are the slaves. So over the years, there's a number of... I used to go to the Messianic Congress and sing and dance with the best of them. I have my church. If I ever start a church again, we're going to do Messianic songs, and we're going to dance, and I'll throw my yarmulke on at times, and we'll have fun. But we are all the children of Abraham by faith in Christ Jesus. There's to be no segregation. So I really hesitate. I worry about where is this going to end? Where do you draw the line? Paul said circumcision means nothing. Well, if someone says, well, it's very important, Paul says it wasn't. He didn't even make Timothy get circumcised. I mean, get a grip here. So I worry about the direction some of the groups have gone. Their Jewishness, culturally speaking, may reach a point it's incompatible with Orthodox Christianity. That's my worry. So I would say a cultural thing, fine. You want to have a Seder, you want to have Passover, you want to have some cultural things, fine. But don't pretend that this is what a Christian ought to do, or Christians ought to observe the feasts. Anytime someone says you ought to do something, you shove a Bible in their face and say, show me in the New Testament. You can't show me, then I can if I want to, but I don't have to. Next question. Chris has one right there.
The answer, I went to...
Well, you need to speak there so they get it recorded.
I appreciate that answer. I went to one of those Jewish Messianic Christian fellowships on 226.
A nice Gentile boy like you?
Oh, I was invited. I had a good time. I loved the dancing, singing. I thought I was watching the Fiddler on the Roof, but there is a movement that's going in the wrong direction. But back to Matthew 12, it's interesting. Does that ever cross your mind on thou shalt not steal when they're picking somebody else's grain? Culturally?
No, you had a cultural Levitical law that stated that the poor could glean along the edges because there was a moral principle involved, thou shalt not kill.
Thank you.
So that would be transferable. If I had an orange grove and I caught some poor people taking some oranges and eating them, I would let them do it. It's just the entrepreneurs come in with trucks and 50 pickers from Tijuana, then I got out my shotgun. Yes, it was a cultural law. They couldn't object to that, but there was a moral principle beneath it, namely, you shall preserve life, and that's why Ruth was able to go and glean the fields. I applied that in Perry County when I first moved to Pennsylvania, and the church was paying me $100 a week. How many of you think I had difficulty living on $100 a week? So several of the people were farmers, and this one farmer did a huge harvest of red-skinned potatoes. So I came and asked him, and I showed him the passage where the poor could glean. My wife and I got down on all fours because these big tractors can't pick up the small potatoes. So we harvested bags of potatoes, and I took them back and I canned them. And for about 2 years, we lived on these little potatoes that I had canned in my, my jars and all the rest of it. And that to me was a perfect example where he said, sure, otherwise it would rot. Oh, they were very good potatoes, particularly made with the paprika and the this and the that and the that and the this. But another question, not a cooking lesson. Down here up front. By the way, let me ask just off to the side. I'm tempted to put in, to make my newsletter fun, to put in a recipe now and then. I thought about doing the one on the Bob's Flourless Chocolate Cake. So I may put that in a future newsletter and see what happens. Go ahead.
If you were to go back into the law on your own, would you feel guilty of that?
Let me see if I translate this. Some of the Messianic Jews want to revive many of the Old Testament feasts and dances, cultural things, Israeli culture. As long as they call it cultural and optional, that they're trying to become all things to all men and to win these fellow Jews to Christ, I don't have an argument. But if they say these laws are still in effect, like kosher, you may not eat ribs, no pork ribs. Well, I always told my wife, I will die waving a rib in my hand. They'll have to peel the dead fingers off of that rib bone. I ain't giving it up no matter what the doctor says. They'll have to take it out of this frozen hand. Then the answer is they are become false brothers. They are Judaizers who are trying to drag everybody back to beggarly elements. That's what Paul described. All these, he called them beggarly elements. He said, stand fast in the liberty wherewith Christ has set you free. So if it's only optional and cultural and they're having fun and it's a shtick and they make money by it, fine. But if they think you have to keep the law, then they are false brothers, and they are the Judaizers that Paul rebuked to their face in Galatians 1. Good questions, very intelligent questions. All right, since we're having trouble with the equipment, I'll give a translation. Number one, do I enjoy the fact that in our culture, the English Presbyterian Puritan view that Sunday is now the Sabbath was legalized? They're called blue laws. And nothing was open. Well, I wouldn't go to that extreme. How many people of God's people go out to a restaurant to eat after church? How many of God's people have to fill gas in the tank in order to get to church? How many turn on the TV? And how many like to sit back or meet with friends and on down the line? To go back to the Scottish view in which Saturday night sundown was the beginning of the Sabbath. You could not eat any cooked meal Saturday night. You could not have a fire and cook any hot meal during the day Saturday. Women really rested. I've seen these Sabbatarians. Well, I believe in the Sabbath. Come on down. My wife's cooked a heavy meal. Who's up there working but that poor woman? Hypocrisy, seems to me. So no, I don't want to go back to that. But do I miss the fact that Sunday had a religious air about it with the blue laws? Yes. Culturally, we've lost something. The malls are open. Thankfully, the highways are not as clogged. That's a cultural thing, and I appreciate it. It sort of fell out of the Puritans as a good thing. There were other things they did that didn't quite survive, burning witches, If you broke the Sabbath, they put you in the dunking chair. How many of you know about dunking chair? They put you in a chair with a pole and submerged you in the water a long time for breaking the Sabbath, such as your kid being born on Sunday. So I don't miss that at all. Any other questions? We have communion tonight, so that's the reason I needed to finish up. Yes, sir.
Are the Jews of the Old Testament less guilty of rejecting Christ as the Messiah than those during when Jesus was on earth?
Okay, this is a very good question. There is a basic assumption that I think needs to be faced. Just because some of the Jews at the crucifixion said, "Let his death be on our heads and the heads of our children," does not mean that God viewed it as that. When we come to Acts chapter 4, it says when Pontius Pilate, Herod, the Jews, and the Gentiles conspired together against Christ, they crucified the Lord of glory. So when God looked at the crucifixion of Christ, it was humanity, man qua man. The Jews themselves, as a people, did not bear any greater responsibility than anybody else. Regardless of what they said, it doesn't mean God had to take what they said as law. In Acts 4, everyone is implicated. You and I are implicated in the death of Christ. So by that type of reasoning, the answer is they're not any more responsible than what we are or anybody else is. We're all responsible from the first Adam to the last human being.